with IRG in the driver's seat, is Roger-Mark De Souza. He's going to talk to us about, well, Roger-Mark is with the Wilson Center. He's the director of the Population Environmental Security and Resilience program here. And he's going to talk to us about observations and engagement the Wilson Center has had with projects around the world that are bringing together what a few or 10 years ago might have seen as different strands of development: women's empowerment, public health, climate adaptation, food security, et cetera, pulling them together and trying to weave the strengths of each together for to generate greater resilience for the communities in question. Fair enough? Okay. And one of the things that I enjoy about working with Roger-Mark and the Wilson Center is that the Wilson Center is a think tank, but they also are out engaging in communities, engaging in telling stories from communities. They've done trainings for me and my team, building on some work we did in Jamaica. And so they are a think tank, but they are also a think tank that gets their hands dirty and gets out and gets direct feedback from communities, which I think is great. So I will stop talking and turn it over to Roger-Mark.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, John, and thank you for coming today. I think a lot of you probably know the Wilson Center. So we serve as a living memorial to President Wilson, and our mandate is to focus on international development priorities. And we do that through a combination of research and analysis, convening, engagement, storytelling, media work, social blogging, social media work. We work quite rigorously with journalists to help them understand the issues from a technical perspective and frame them for policymakers. And we do a lot of high-level policy engagement also. So I direct our programs on global sustainability and resilience. And we work quite closely with John and a number of other partners at USAID. So in looking at the questions around adaptation, resilience, and integration, I wanted to talk a little bit more broadly about some of the things that we are seeing as lost opportunities in terms of deficits, some of what we hear now in our narrative and discussion on resilience, and to think about what that means in terms of dividends. And what are some of the new approaches? What are some of the innovations that we're seeing, particularly in bringing in the social dimensions of adaptation and resilience? So I'm going to go through a few slides that I have for you, and I'm going to show you a short clip of a movie that we produced. It's just about 10 minutes long of some of the work that we have been doing with partners in Tanzania. I'll take you back just a little bit to when the tsunami hit in Asia in 2004. So there were, once again, you remember, there were 3 waves, and the animation that you see here is when the time lapse between when one wave hit the first wave and the third wave. And, you know, we know that more than 250,000 people were killed, and I remember going into these areas in 2005 and talking to the community members who had been impacted, who had barely escaped, who had lost family members, and who had lost their livelihoods. And I was quite struck when we experienced a similar thing with Katrina in New Orleans. And you know, the conversations coming out of Southeast Asia and coming back to the United States, many of my colleagues hadn't fully recognized our vulnerability. Philippines, and we know that there are a number of reasons why these things continue to be important. These shocks and that are having these impacts on people's lives are producing a number of deficits that are important for us in the climate change adaptation community, in the development community, and in the humanitarian community. Why is this so important, and why is it important now? Of course, the obvious loss of lives, and for those who survive, the loss of livelihoods, stability, and well-being. But you look at some of the most vulnerable regions of the world, like the Sahel, 20 million people are estimated to be food insecure and already reliant on humanitarian assistance. You look at the Horn of Africa, As a development community, we recognize that we're still working on the consequences of the drought from 2011, and that you look at the economies and the economic impacts of these events, and we're still reeling from them. In Asia, on average, 400 million people will be vulnerable to flooding, and we know globally that $58 billion is the global average in terms of economic losses to insured natural catastrophic impacts. So an analysis at the World Bank had looked at what this meant in terms of development dollars and determined that for every $1 of development funding invested, these shocks that are happening, we're losing $3. So we're operating at a deficit. Apart from the human toll, from an investment perspective, from a development and a humanitarian perspective, it makes us wonder if we're putting our monies to best use, and how can we save people's lives and their livelihoods. So we recognize that this is becoming increasingly important, and right now the very popular way and term to address this is to look at dividends, and we talk very often about a resilience dividend. And this is a term that has been coined by the Rockefeller Foundation, and we're hearing it more and more, this resilience dividend. And I think USAID talks about resilience as the ability of people, households, communities, countries, and systems, so looking also at natural systems, to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stresses in a manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. So this is a little bit of how USAID is defining resilience. And this is interesting because they're looking at it at different scales. They're looking at how people respond and what it means in terms of livelihoods and growth opportunities. Generally, practitioners in resilience who are implementing these programs on the ground, when they talk about the dividends of resilience, they talk about them in terms of triple dividends. The first dividend is what losses can we avoid? So when a disaster strikes, if we're building in place and putting in place resiliency approaches, we minimize those losses. So that's one dividend, one advantage. A second is what is often termed a development dividend. So you're unlocking the development potential by stimulating innovation and looking at what this means in terms of economic activity that helps reduce disaster-related risks and what it means for overall investment and well-being. So sort of there's an overall development benefit that is accumulated. And then there's a question of co-benefits, looking at the synergies of bringing together social, environmental, and economic approaches to build resilience around disaster risk management, so that even if a disaster does not happen for many years, there are some benefits that we can see across sectors. Now this is, sounds really good. Raises a lot of questions for me, right? But this is interesting to see how we are thinking about this resilience programming and what it means for us who have been working on adaptation for a while now. So, what is this approach? What does it really mean to be resilient? So basically, you start with your context. You're looking at a social group, a region, an institution, a system, and you're trying to get a sense of resilience of what to what. And we talk about a disturbance, which is essentially can be a shock or stress. And these could be the natural hazards we've been talking about, conflict, insecurity, food shortages, high fuel prices are some examples. And then looking at the capacity to deal with that disturbance, so the level of exposure, the sensitivity, and the adaptive capacity to those shocks and stresses, and then how you react to this. Do you survive, cope, recover, learn, transform? The term that we very often hear now is we bounce back better. But at times we're just bouncing back. Other times we are recovering, but maybe we're worse off. And then there are other times when the system or the community may collapse. So this is sort of the general framing that we use in terms of resilience thinking and programming. Another way to look at this in terms of a conceptual framework, so very, very similar, but once again, you get to the point where you have a sense of the shocks and stresses, a level of exposure, but what it means in terms of livelihood assets, structures and processes, and livelihood strategies. So very interesting if you look at this from a livelihood perspective and you think of a resilience pathway and a vulnerability pathway. So you bounce back better, bounce back, recover or collapse, and then what it means in terms of livelihood outcomes. So food security, adequate nutrition, environmental security, or food insecurity, malnutrition, environmental degradation. So as a community of practice that is building on the work that we have been doing in the adaptation community and in other development and humanitarian sectors, we're trying to get a sense of how this all comes together in terms of livelihoods, in terms of disaster mitigation, in terms of health, in terms of food security, and in terms of overall development interventions, and how do we operationalize and measure these types of interventions. So USAID's resilience strategy posits that you have sort of the sensitivity and exposure components at the very top, but at the very heart gets to the questions of good governance and women's empowerment. So very interesting for me that we see women's empowerment really having a very central role in how USAID conceptualizes this. And then you see questions around adaptive capacity and risk reduction, the response leading ultimately to sustainable reduction in growth, in vulnerability and inclusive growth, promoting inclusive growth. So this is what USAID is working on mainstreaming across its different bureaus. But there are a number of critiques to this overall resilience approach, not just at USAID, but overall. This approach to resilience, what are some of the limitations? What are some of the challenges? Where are the shortcomings in terms of how this has been conceptualized? Generally, when we examine these approaches, we see that there is typically a very poor treatment, analysis, operationalization of questions around power, politics, and the social dimensions. Very, very difficult to get your hands around these questions, but the power to build resilience, reduce resilience. How do groups use the framing to further their ends? Gender dynamics. These are some of the issues that we see typically missing in the resilience programming and conceptualization. And the power dynamics is a critical dimension. We also see that there is a criticism with regard to resilience not considering step changes or transformational. So typically it is determined that there are a number of feedback loops and the process is incremental. How that happens exactly, because it's such a dynamic process, is not very clearly understood nor well articulated. So as that is being developed, these are some of the criticisms we see of the programming. And then there's generally a lack of normativity. Is it a direction? Is it a goal? Whose vision of resilience for whom? What are the trade-offs? Who are the winners or losers? And what are the trade-offs across scales of systems and sectors? And we know these are questions that we often raise in the development sector. But these are, I think, of some particular gaps that we see in resilience thinking and programming. And I think this is an opportunity for us to think about how we might have addressed some of these issues in looking at adaptation programming and how that could help inform some of the resilience thinking. So there are a number of examples of programs that are being considered as resilience programs. So here's an example. Mercy Corps has a microinsurance catastrophic risk organization program in Haiti that provides insurance payouts that are linked to shocks. And it provides an opportunity to look at the effects of shocks and thinking of which point they can provide these interventions and support. Catholic Relief Services working in Kenya has been looking at the impact of droughts on livestock and looking at how the provision and restoration of goat herds lost as a consequence of that drought could help build resilience in those communities. CARE's Pathway to Empowerment program looks at resilience livelihoods and what it means to invest in human capital. And it's interesting to me, I don't know when these programs were designed that they were necessarily conceptualized as resilience programs. But I think now with this new lens, we're able to go back to many of these programs and say, okay, we're trying to pull all of these pieces together in a resilience framework, and we can attach this label of resilience programming to them. And I think that's useful. It has some limitations. But I think as a community, we need to move above and beyond that. How do we actually design and implement our resilience programs from the outset? So there's a sense of how do we actually build resilience? We need to integrate livelihoods, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation into a single framework. We're looking at it at multiple scales, individuals, households, communities, higher level systems, and also looking at capacity building, which gets to these questions around the absorptive capacity to absorb those shocks, to adapt and also transform to those shocks, and recognizing that they can exist at multiple scales and be mutually reinforcing. So one way that USAID and others have tried to get a sense of how to handle this is to issue a global resilience challenge and say, listen, there are a number of deficits here. It's a real challenge. What does the community think? What's innovative? What can we do? So USAID has done this together with Rockefeller Foundation and CEDAR in Sweden, and focusing on 3 critical, very vulnerable areas, or chronically vulnerable areas: the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. And their approach is quite interesting. They talk about 5 core areas. And one of the specific areas that they're looking at is the role of technology. How can technology and technological solutions be particularly innovative and creative in responding to these shocks, anticipating these shocks, planning for them, responding to them, and allowing the response to be transformative? How do you document these? How do you adopt them? How do you scale them up? And how do you integrate them? Measurement and diagnostics. They're looking to support measurement approaches to quantify and qualify the financial and social impacts of resilience efforts. And how do you measure, visualize, and predict? How do you measure? Not easy. A huge question for this community. How do you measure? How do you visualize? How do we get our matrices so that we can understand what is going on? And how do we use that as a decision-making tool so that we can predict resilience needs and measure and monitor how we're doing? So this is one of the specific focus areas of this global resilience partnership. There's a deliberate effort to look at innovative financing. What are some of the unconventional financial instruments that we can bring to the table to mobilize additional private capital for resilience and increase the sustainability of resiliency efforts? Of course, a major part of this is bringing on the resilience, the private sector. It's very interesting to see what's happening in the insurance and reinsurance industry. So I'm part of a partnership. It's called a Global Resilience Academy that's supported by the Munich Re Foundation. And the Munich Re is a reinsurance industry that's providing resiliency payouts to small-scale farmers in the Caribbean who are able to anticipate and predict these shocks, and they get these payouts before the shock occurs so that their livelihoods are not disrupted. It's a very innovative way of thinking about how we anticipate and prevent a disruption in livelihoods. DuPont Pioneer is looking at how they can provide financing that helps promote food security and resilience, particularly in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. So I was chatting with them just last week, and I was telling them about sort of this work, and they said, well, you know, you charities, you in the development sector might be critical of us in the private sector, but we are looking at how do we help use these financing mechanisms to enable these communities to build their food security, be more resilient, but also to be economically viable? We want these communities themselves to get a profit for themselves and their interests. So this is part of what the Global Resilience Partnership is looking to leverage. How can we leverage new and innovative financing approaches? In particular, the Global Resilience Partnership is looking at because it has brought together USAID, the Rockefeller Foundation, and CEDAR to think about how it can position the resilience and resiliency approaches on a global agenda. What are the insights? What are the evidence? And how can it use its global convening power to continue to build and learn from each other? So I know John mentioned that you would be looking at urban resilience soon. I was at the Rockefeller's retreat center in Italy, working with Rockefeller Foundation's global resiliency officers who are based in their 100 resilient cities all over the world, and looking at how they can be innovators of resiliency in an urban setting. And this is what they're trying to do through this platform to promote shared learning and networking. And this is sort of their fifth area. How do we continue to learn and fill knowledge gaps that help inform the different sectors? So very, very interesting approach from a donor perspective to issue this challenge, which we're seeing more and more of. Think of joint financing mechanisms. How do they, as a coalition, then utilize their platform? How do they help move the agenda forward? How do they bring on new partners like the private sector for innovative financing? And how do they continue to keep it going? So very, very, lots of questions again, but interesting to see this development and this issuance of a global challenge. We've seen this from Gates, we've seen this from the Canadians. It's a model that's out there for joint financing. So this idea of the resilience dividend, and this is from the Rockefeller Foundation, is basically to say we're facing an unprecedented risk. We're slow to adapt, or when we're facing these risks, we are slower to adapt. It's harder to respond, it takes longer to recover, so we have to find ways that our investment can limit disaster and spur new growth. So interestingly enough, and I think in our communities here in the United States, we don't talk enough about what's happening with our partners across the pond. So interesting to see what's happening from the perspective of the European community, and they have a very clearly articulated action plan for resilience that not only brings together the humanitarian and development sectors, but very specifically focuses on political engagement. And they are looking to increase food security, social protection, adaptation to climate change, and they're using it based on their principles of aid effectiveness, mainstreaming across sectors, and looking how to deliver early results and push the agenda forward within the context of the European Commission. And their principles are start with what's country-owned and country-led. How do they really build those connections at the local level? That equity is one of their key core principles. Coherence, complementarity, coordination, and continuity at various scales, and how to address what is known as covariate risks, those that affect many people at the same time. And they actually have an implementation plan, an operational plan that goes to year 2020 that has 3 key priority intervention areas. The first area is to support development and implementation of national and regional resilience approaches, capacities, and partnerships like AGIR, which is the Global Alliance for Resilience Initiative, operating mostly in Sahel, West Africa, and SHARE, which is supporting the Horn of Africa resilience. So they want to continue those efforts, but they want to also look at what they would consider flagship initiatives, and how do you get those flagship initiatives to scale up? So that's sort of the first intervention area for the European Commission. The second is looking at innovation, learning, and advocacy. And within this second dimension, they have a very strong focus on social protection initiatives, risk financing mechanisms, and promoting and spurring competitive local private sector. So a very strong focus on social nets and the private sector. And their third area is looking at methodologies and tools to support resilience. So, and what does this mean in terms of looking at multi-hazards and multi-sectoral risk assessments, risk management, and measuring resilience? So it's very good when we think of the Global Resilience Partnership that CEDA is part of this, because that helps us bring in the European perspective and think of opportunities to collaborate also. So there's quite a lot going on. So what we at the Wilson Center try to figure out as we look at this landscape, we say, okay, what's missing? Where do we come in? Where are some of the gaps? Where can we help fill the knowledge? Where can we help convene? Where can we help think about the innovations? And we, through our programming, we do a lot of programming on conflict and peace building and how that is tied to climate change, fragility, and vulnerability. So we will then think about this in the context of resilience. We do a lot of work on women's empowerment, reproductive health, maternal health. How does this fit in? And how does this help promote resilience when this is very often missed, yet is so recognized, addressing the population dynamics as being central to vulnerability? And then when we look at opportunities where we see some of the most vulnerable, and you talk to and you work with partners in these very vulnerable communities, how do we recognize innovations that are occurring at their level that are not very often recognized because they're always couched in terms of fragility and vulnerability? So I'm from the Caribbean, I come from an island. When I work with my Caribbean counterparts, they say to me, we're always portrayed as being so vulnerable, those poor islands. We always have to help them. Yes, we need the help, but at the same time, what are the innovations that are specific to their local context that can provide an opportunity for learning for others in the sector? So these are some of the things that we feel are typically missed, that we try to examine from a theoretical, analytical, practical, and policy engagement perspective and capture some of the stories on the ground. So we see this as very much occurring from the ground up, and this is some work that we had done in collaboration with Population. This is done by Population Action International, and we had helped them think about what this means and how do you take this out to a wider audience. We're looking at the areas in gold or yellow or green, however you see that, looking at high population growth. These are parts of the world where there's high population growth and high projected declines in agricultural production. So lots of people and agricultural production is going down. The areas that you see here in orange are areas of high population growth and low resilience to climate change. So we developed a proxy for resilience to climate change, looking at 17 indicators across sectors that included civil society engagement, infrastructure, policy responses, economic indicators. So these are the parts of the world where there's high population growth and a low resilience to climate change. And the areas in red are the areas of the world that are experiencing these three variables: high population growth and densities, low agricultural production, and low resilience to climate change. The diagonal lines indicate parts of the world where there's high water stress or water scarcity. So we put these together and say, wow, we recognize that population dynamics increase climate change variability. When we look at some of the approaches in terms of what women and families say in terms of the number of kids that they have, they say, well, you know what? We would actually like to have less children, but we can't get access to these services. That's what we call an unmet need for family planning or reproductive health services. And these are the areas that you see with those dots. Those are part of the world. So we're not trying to suggest causality here, but we're saying when you look at these stresses and you pull them together and you look at the parts of the world where women are saying, we would like to have access to these services, we would like to have more power over the decisions that we made with regard to our fertility, we think that maybe there's an opportunity to think about how family planning, reproductive health, women's empowerment can be a very strategic, resilient strategy at low cost that provides an impact that is known and that is delivered within a short period of time. So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to highlight. And here's an example of some of the work that we have done and worked with partners in the Philippines. This was conducted by Save the Children US in the Philippines. And the image that you see on the right is a family, couples who are going to a health clinic to access family planning, reproductive health services. So they go to this clinic and they go through a vulnerability assessment process whereby they are mapping out some of the vulnerabilities and recreating this in three-dimensional maps throughout the community. And then they end up planting mangroves. So they go in for family planning services and they end up replanting mangroves. And it's all coordinated, integrated, systematic, and it's responding to their needs, and it makes sense to them. So how do you measure something like this? Well, you say the husband comes home and he says, honey, tonight's the night. And she says, no, we got to think of the mangroves. Not exactly, but they're trying to capture those kinds of things. To what degree are people making these associations? Because they make it in their lives. They say, this is how we live our lives. We don't live our lives in silos. How can we break this down in a way that is responding to their needs, where they see this in a very real way? So I'd like to show you a little film that highlights some of these connections in Tanzania. And we'll take a short look at this, and I'll tell you a little bit about the film.
In the last decade, Tanzania's sustained economic growth, political stability, and considerable natural resources have made it a beacon for East Africa. But despite economic gains, high rates of poverty persist in the country's rural coastal communities, where access to quality healthcare is limited. The added pressure of rapid population growth burdens the fragile social service system and places greater stress on natural resources and the surrounding environment. The seemingly simple act of cooking the day's meal was helping to destroy Tanzania's Saadani National Park and the surrounding forests, where community members cut wood for fuel even though it is forbidden by law. The introduction of a new and relatively cheap energy-saving stove addresses these complex and connected issues with a practical solution.
Mabadiliko zamani tulikuwa tunapata shida sana. Wakati wa kuamka kufanya kazi zetu, itabidi asubuhi tushite tukoke moto, tupuzie. Lakini hili majiko toka tulivyopata, ukota tu kama vile malanda yale, unaweka kuni, unaweka malanda na moto kidogo basi.
The old stove they used to use per day you need 9. Per day you need 9, but this today you need for this one only 3. The whole day you cook. The old stoves, you have to face the smoke. Smoking is too much. For the health benefit, that's very important. So this one, there's very minimal smoke, which for us, health part is very important.
Along with the health and environment benefits, the energy-saving stove affords more time to focus on improving livelihoods and generating income, especially for women. Rukia, a peer educator on topics as diverse as savings and loans, reproductive health, and conservation, has gone from owning an energy-saving stove to selling bread and honey. The proceeds from sales allowed her to afford a new roof for her house.
Enzi za zamani wazazi walikuwa tuseme walikuwa kina mama hawana haki. Halafu pia ilikuwa hakuna biashara za kujihangaisha. Kwa sasa hivi kidogo tunashukuru, hasa tunashukuru TCMP. Toka alipoingia yani katika kijiji chetu kutoboa miradi, kina mama tumeamka tuko mbele.
Such practical and effective solutions, like the energy-saving stove, are typical tools of an integrated approach known as PHE, or Population, Health, and Environment. These major areas of development work, which are sometimes isolated in policy, are all naturally connected. To better understand the challenges these communities face, we need to examine how these issues interact. In the coastal regions of Pangani district, overfishing has become a problem. To keep up with increased consumption and make money, fishermen turn to exploitative and unsustainable practices.
Ni kutumia baruti ndio uvuvi ambao unaharibu mazingira. Na kutia dawa uvuvi haramu ule, sumu ndio uvuvi ambao unaharibu mazingira.
Helping to alleviate the need for exploitative fishing is the environmentally sound practice of seaweed cultivation. As an alternative livelihood, women in Pangani and Tanga districts cultivate plots along the nearby shores. It provides these women with a cash income roughly double what a family might earn from other, more environmentally destructive activities.
Mariculture activities are kind of alternative income generating activities to make them go from illegal fishing to other more environmental friendly activities.
While practices like seaweed cultivation and clean cook stoves are part of the solution, the need exists for a more holistic approach. The growing number of people dependent on local natural resources, trees for fuel, fish for subsistence, is unsustainable both economically and ecologically. Family planning and women's empowerment are key to a long-term integrated approach to addressing these problems.
Pale unapokuwa unazaa watoto wengi kupita maelezo, kwanza pana athari zinajitokeza mbili. Watoto wanaweza kupata utapiamlo kwa kutokana kwamba unashindwa kuwalisha lishe inayokamilika katika nyumba kwa sababu familia imekuwa ni kubwa. Na pili, panapokuwa na watoto wengi, ni lazima hali ya mazingira itakuwa ni mbaya tu. Itabidi uingie mpaka sehemu labda ukakate misitu kwa sababu ya kulisha watoto. Kikubwa tunachohamasisha kwamba watoto wawe wa wastani wa kuweza kwamba hawa watoto wanaweza kuwalisha, kuwavisha na kuwatunza kielimu.
Training
and sort of traces the degree to which having access to reproductive health services have made them more resilient in their communities and have allowed them to become community leaders. So we have produced a series of films. They're all 10 minutes long, looking at clean cook stoves in Tanzania, forest stewardship groups in Nepal, looking at youth engagement programs and intergenerational work that's being done in Ethiopia. And we use this as a way to highlight some of the key lessons. So just about 6 weeks ago, we had the president of Tanzania here, and we had a private briefing with him. 5 of us in my boss's office, Jane Harmon. We brought in our USAID person who works on reproductive health issues. But then I started to talk to him about these issues. And it just so happens that he is from Bagamoyo, which is one of the areas that's featured in the film. And I said, well, Mr. President, you know about this approach, and this is highlighting your village. And he got very excited and took it back to the community. But this is the type of storytelling that we want to capture and think about how we can use that for high-level policy engagement in addition to programmatic interventions. I'm going to tell you another story of an outstanding woman, Birhane Fikade. She's from Ethiopia. She's a model farmer. I met Birhane a few years ago. She was in her early 40s when I met her. And I said she is now this community leader. And I said, Birhane, wow, I'm so impressed. Tell me your story. And she said, well, Roger-Mark, you have to understand that I have 11 children. And with 11, whoa, 11 children. She said, well, they're not all mine. I said, really? I adopted 1. So by her early 40s, she had given birth to at least 10 children who had survived. I didn't ask if she had lost any children. And she's now this amazing model farm. And I said, well, tell me your story. And she explained to me that in Ethiopia, there's a very sophisticated agricultural extension service that they have coupled with a similarly sophisticated health extension service. And they have these health and agricultural extension workers going out in teams, providing training in some of the most vulnerable areas of the country. And she said, well, I received this training and I realized, wow, I can actually decide not to have more kids. And she said, this was difficult. I'm a beautiful woman. My husband can't keep his hands off me. But I managed to convince him. And because that training was coupled with agricultural extension training, and I live in one of the most vulnerable areas of the community, of the country, I learned some new techniques that allowed me to increase my yield. And number one, I said to my husband, no more kids. Number two, I said, listen, here's some economic production that can really make a difference to our livelihoods. And she became she did very well. Her husband was very impressed. And all of the young women in her community started to come to her and say, how did you do this? And she started telling her story. And she said, and I was amazed, she said to me, this is what I need to do to be resilient. And I just thought, wow. Here you have this system of working with extension workers in both the agricultural sector and the health sector in an integrated way, saving money, having this impact on people's lives, and a very compelling story that we want to capture. But I know that when I talk to my climate change colleagues and I say family planning, reproductive health, and that helps increase resilience and climate change adaptation, they say, what? What are you talking about? John and I have had this discussion over the years. So, reproductive health services and family planning, you're investing in women, you're increasing their empowerment, their agency in the social sector, economic, and health sectors that helps increase their efficacy in terms of income and assets, mobility, educational attainment, environmental stewardship, community participation, helping to build climate change resilience. And we've seen this. This has been documented. There's an approach to it. There's a theory behind it. There's a whole body of literature behind this approach. But it's very often an area of intervention that is missing, but very compelling, very powerful. And we know that when we look at the climate change agreements, that there are legal mandates for thinking about these approaches and how do we bring these concerns forward. And it's interesting to me that when I visit some of our projects here, even in our country, in New Orleans, this is the Vietnamese community that was, no one speaks English, it's a fishing community. After Katrina hit, they were Red Cross. They were their town was supposed to be totally eliminated. And they said, well, this is ridiculous. They had no trust in the local decision makers, and they were mobilized by a Roman Catholic priest, a Vietnamese Roman Catholic priest, who helped them think about how they could develop strategies that were more integrated, that helped increase their food security and resilience in that community. And as I met with them and looked at what they had implemented, it was Birhane's story in a US context. And it's so compelling to see that these are not just stories of adaptation and resilience overseas in these vulnerable countries, that we have our own vulnerabilities here in the United States, and that there's an opportunity for that learning also. So, an important story. One of the things in working in the Philippines is that they're so creative and innovative and such wonderful youth. One of the things that we did, apart from things like community theater and engagement in public forums, working with journalists, sort of having slogans, we had a Miss Population, Health and Environment, a Miss PHE contest, and their platform was on integration. This was a beauty contest, but it was all about development integration. And if you know the Filipino psyche, this is one way to resonate in a very popular way. So just very interesting to think about ways you engage youth and why that is important so that they can ultimately go to their Congress and make the case in the political circles. So we think youth engagement is key. We've also worked with colleagues. These are some colleagues based in Austria who have looked at the impact of education, particularly secondary education, and had done some analysis globally looking at pre-disaster, when a disaster hits, and post-disaster impacts and preparedness and resilience. And what they have found is that secondary education is one of the most beneficial interventions at a country, community, and individual level in developing resilience and adapting to these shocks. So some very interesting analyses and studies that were conducted. I think it was about 14 countries. Of course, thinking of questions around traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge, and how do you bring that to the fore. I do a lot of work with partners in the South Pacific who are looking at when these local communities, these indigenous communities, know that a disaster is going to occur, that they're cutting some of the cassava plants that they know will last for a period of time so that they have a food source once the disaster hits. That they have a long tradition of planting certain crops that have a quick generation cycle so that they have some food security when a disaster hits. So to what degree are we capturing these examples? How are we looking at community engagement and visualization that brings in elders and young people? This is some of the work in the Philippines that is doing that. And just sort of recognizing questions around governance also. This is a very interesting example from the Philippines where the typhoon had hit in Tocloban. I was there a few weeks before Supertyphoon Haiyan hit. And one of the projects that we had been working on there is with a group that was looking at local accountability measures for budget tracking. So the Philippines is very decentralized, and by law, 5% of all of the local budgets must go to gender. And they were tracking the degree to which these local budgets were accounting for gender vulnerabilities in climate change. So this thing that you see here is what they call an accountability board. By law, at the local barangay and municipal levels, they must, by law, have these accountability boards up. And we were working with these local counterparts who were keeping the local decision makers accountable for spending monies in ways in which they were supposed to. Very, very difficult work, but very important. But it's such an innovative and new strategy, very specific to a decentralized country, but interesting to think of these innovative approaches to building resilience and accountability. So, you know, when we look at the fifth assessment reports, we talk about pathways to resilient, and we know resilience, and we know this is something that we see from these PHE programs, and that it responds quite closely to the climate resilient pathways. So just to end, to say that we know that of our increase in vulnerability, shocks and stresses will occur, that if we're thinking of resilience, that there's an element of that where we need to be absorptive, we need to be adaptive, we also need to think about how we can be transformative. We need to think about how we engage a variety of sectors, including youth. We need to think about accountability measures and community mobilization and involving women. Think about ways that they can be scalable. This is some work in Madagascar. And thinking of future prospects, recognizing that as we build resilience, that there's a space for mitigation, there's a space for adaptation. Between yesterday and today, I had 3 meetings where I had people say to me, well, you know, adaptation, if we do that, we're admitting failure. And I was like, whoa, let's talk about this. Or someone said, well, colleague I met with USAID today, and I was talking about adaptation. He said, well, you know, if you want to do all of that, we have to put in place some mitigation elements first. So, you know, how do we talk about mitigation and adaptation in the same space? And how is this really an opportunity to build resilience from the ground up? So there you have it. Some questions.
we have another microphone? Oh, great. So thank you, Roger-Mark. I won't take up time by asking my own questions. I saw Mike. And just raise your hand if you have a question. And please do talk into the microphone because we're broadcast. Can't hear.
Well, first of all, thanks. So I'm Michael Brody with Stratus Consulting, although we are now Apt Associates. And so I'd like to ask you about accountability measures. So if you're a government person managing an adaptation program somewhere, have you developed a list at all of measures that people are using? So you have budget resources by some percentage and you have to sort of hold these programs accountable. Have you started looking at any of those, developing any, observing any? I'd be very curious. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So the folks that we were working with were from civil society. They were not. They were holding the local government folks accountable. And there's an entire body of work looking at budget accountability in the population sector. And there are a series of guidelines, practices, trainings that are being conducted on budget accountability measures. How do you implement them? What do you look for? How do you do that in different contexts? A lot of the work has been done in Africa, but we're looking at how do you apply that to Southeast Asia. So the budget accountability work is very important. And I think it's very important for work where you have donors coming together, because more and more donors are doing joint financing, but they're looking for local governments to step in and make commitments also. So I can, if you give me your card, I can track down some of those resources and send a few things to you.
Laurie Krieger from the Manoff Group. I'd like to go back to the critiques of resilience, please.
I saw you shaking your head.
Yeah,
you agreed with a lot of that.
Yeah, I did. And my discipline as a whole does. So what we have basically is an approach that is dominated a lot by economists and neoliberal way of looking at the world. So let's go back to some kind of social factors that underlie not only vulnerability into climate change, but vulnerability across the board. Yeah. Let's take Katrina.
Yeah.
What you're talking about is this great community, but there's an two underlying social themes that in fact explain what happened in Katrina. One is racism, which is a core cultural value in this country, and the other is social class, which I have seen in a couple of E3 procurements, but generally it's the lowest economic quintile, which does not substitute for social class. So how would you address it looking at those kinds of factors? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a critical question, and I think, my opinion is, how do you mainstream something like this in a USAID that is organized according to bureaus, okay? So my feeling is if you centralize this within USAID and make one bureau responsible for it, it's not going to happen. It's not going to be mainstream. You're going to let others off the hook, right? So I think one of the ways that they tried to address this in USAID in the Sahel was through a process that they call joint planning cells, okay? So they use this approach in the Sahel as a short gap measure to think about how they can address and build resilience, but how they can also be considering these social dimensions across a platform of interventions that related not only to how USAID operated in country or in region, but with other donors, right? So I think that's super hard to do in a USAID given its structure and bureaucracy, which is there for a certain reason. What's interesting to me is when you have these partnerships like a Global Resilience Partnership, where you have a Rockefeller Foundation coming in that has a little bit more flexible financing, And they are thinking about, we want to develop leadership, we want to address these social dimensions, we want to look at gender, we want innovative financing. And the USAID is coming in and saying, well, we have to coordinate across these bureaus and we have to get these approvals. And then you have the Europeans who I think are still trying to figure out how do you operationalize this in a real way, but their focus is a little bit more on the social protection and those safety nets. So it's it's fascinating to me that you have a USAID with its benefits and limitations and structure. You have a Rockefeller Foundation that can be a little bit more nimble and flexible, and you sort of have the Europeans with a different perspective. So the question for me is, how do you capitalize on that energy? How do you, and you know, you have someone saying, you know, this approach cannot be everything, right? You have to be able to measure an impact. But how do you address these core issues that you're raising, which I agree with? And I think it's this partnership, it's new structures, it's new approaches, bringing those different perspectives in and finding new ways to break down the silos. Yeah. 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 I think it's a really exciting moment for us now, and I think we have to hold these global processes and these challenges accountable for these kinds of things.
We have a question from Jenny Hoffman online from Adaptation Insight. She asks, do you know of evidence or approaches for deciding which resilience intervention might be most effective in any given community? How might you decide whether to invest more family planning, infrastructure, etc.?
It's a really good question. So I think that you're going to where there are chronic vulnerabilities. So I was recently in Niger working with partners from 5 different countries in the Sahel, looking at how we can promote leadership and collaboration for resilience. And was talking with one of my colleagues. So 2 of us there were non-Africans, myself and another guy, and he's been living in Burkina Faso for many years. So he's African. He's Canadian, but he's African. And so, you know, I was the outsider there. And he was saying to me, you know, Roger-Mark, when we think of resilience in the context of the Sahel, the first thing that comes to mind is drought and food security, right? And this whole resilience framing is not that effective in a Sahel because you're talking about questions of chronic vulnerability. A lot of the framing around resilience is these shocks and stresses, but here it's constant. So for a Sahel, it starts with how do you address food security and resilience? But I think that in other areas, you look at conflict-affected areas, it's peace building and how do you address these dimensions. But I don't know that it's an either or. It's how do you start? Where's the point of entry that allows you to think about how you can build integration across the board? And I think that must be driven by what are the greatest vulnerabilities, number one, and also the greatest opportunities to have an impact in the short term that allows you to build some momentum. So you want to build your programming in a way that it would last. You know, in terms of the resiliency programming and implementation on the ground, we talk about, for example, how important it is to have networks and redundancies. Those kinds of approaches from a donor perspective should be implemented in how donors conceptualize the implementation of these projects on the ground. From a donor perspective, how are you creating redundancies that allow for these projects to sustain and continue? And I think that's driven by insight from the ground, in collaboration with the ground, looking at where you can have quick wins, but that set the basis for long-term sustainability.
Hi there, Kim Westerman from Conservation International. I have 2 questions for you, Roger-Mark. The first one, what is it exactly about secondary education that makes people more resilient? And the second one is the example you talked about, the barangays, that they have to put 5% towards gender. And
Yeah,
I was
in the
just wondering what
Philippines.
does that actually mean towards gender? Do you
Okay.
have any examples?
So sorry, what was the first question? Secondary education. So that many of these initiatives, it's easier to get folks started on primary education. The challenge is to keep them in the system long enough so that they're able to accumulate secondary education, and that the understanding that they get through the secondary intervention, education interventions, have made them more networked and more prepared to understand, respond, and build on the networks. And this is very interesting. I was chatting with someone recently, and she was saying, you know, in her country, country in Africa, and she said, we are able to get the girls to go to primary school, but they're all being pulled out. So we were using as a strategy, getting the girls into boarding schools so that they can get secondary education. We almost had to find a way to separate them a little bit from their families. And this is very interesting. It's part of what those studies were showing. So that the benefits of secondary education were higher and more sustainable in terms of building resilience. In the barangays, in the Philippines, 5% of all the local budgets by law must be spent on activities to address gender issues, and it has to be a specific budget allocation. It cannot be monies that you would have already invested in something else, and you're saying, oh, we're going to bring on gender. So there are very specific stipulations about how that money should be used and allocated, and there's an allocation that they get at the local governing units to use that. So these groups, we're trying to hold them accountable and say, no, you can't just shift around the budget line items. You really should be devoting 5% of your budget for new gender initiatives. This is what that money is for by law. The local government officials were not happy.
Thanks. Great presentation, very interesting and a lot to talk about. I have two questions too. The first is, it seems to me that in order to get all the different sectors across the board to sort of buy into resilience, people who aren't working on adaptation, but the other people working on education or women's health, is that you're going to have to show how this type of programming actually has the co-benefits that they're looking for. So it's interesting, this kind of monitoring question and that, because that's really, it seems to me, where it's tricky to show. If their goal is to you know, educate more kids or whatever, they're going to have to show how resilience approach is going to educate more kids. Right?
Yeah,
Okay,
or the humanitarian
vice
folks.
versa, right, yeah, exactly.
And I mean, we have had the head of Red Cross here at the center, and I've asked him about this, and I said, well, how, you know, you only go to this point. What about the next step? And he said, that's development. That's not what we do.
Well, yeah.
We do relief, you know, so it's that. And this resilience framework is specifically looking at bringing together the humanitarian and development communities. Specifically, that is what it's trying to do, bridge that gap. But there is an opportunity to bring on these other sectors. But I think we have to be very careful, because you can't bring on everyone. You know, how realistic is that, and how are you going to measure the impact of that? So you have to set some parameters to be able to do the programming. And I think that's the tough part. That is really tough.
And my second question is about really this issue of the funding, because ultimately what, as you know, is what is making this difficult for humanitarians to get on board is that their funding streams are way too small, first of all, and they're only 1 year.
Right.
So the joint planning cells and what happened in the Sahel and some of these programs that have happened in the Horn of Africa too, where you had pooled funding, were interesting, but they seem to only, I'm worried that they're really only going to last as long as some political will is there to make them happen. So are you seeing, I mean, are the Rockefeller Foundations of the world, are they driving the large multilateral donors towards multi-funding schemes? Are you seeing that trend, or?
I don't know for sure. What I would say is, when you talk to folks in the humanitarian community and you look at their dashboards that they develop, right? There's always a shortfall in terms of the funding, what they anticipate they will need for a particular region and how they can work together. And I think right now there is really strong political will. We're hearing more and more governments and donors talking about this approach as a viable approach. They're hearing about it from communities. And I think that the whole idea behind the Global Resilience Partnership is to try and push that resilience agenda forward so that they can bring on new partners. So I don't know if there's been a specific discussion about multi-year funding, but I think the aim and the approach is to think about pooled funding that can be sustainable over time. So I suspect that that is part of it, but I don't know specifically, concretely. But the Global Resilience Partnership is specifically looking at how to use this international convening power and its visibility to push the agenda forward. But part of the challenge is, the train has left the station and they're still building it, right? So that, it ain't easy. But so they have to respond quickly, but they're trying to figure it out. It looks like an internal knowledge laugh there when I said that comment. It was like, but once again, I'm talking from the outside. I mean, I talk with these folks. I'm not a donor. So this is my sense.
We have a question from Beatriz Moglon from USAID's Low Carbon Resilient Development Program. She asks, how can we measure the impacts of family planning in the short term? Family planning has been around for 60+ years, yet there has been little connection between the climate change, adaptation, and resilient topics and work of the International Planned Parenthood Federation and their associations.
So her question is, how can we measure the impact of family planning? So there are a few studies that have specifically looked at different climate change strategies on the adaptation and mitigation side and have compared that to family planning interventions and have demonstrated the cost effectiveness of family planning interventions that are, where we're talking about voluntary family planning. We're not talking about a one-child policy or the history of forced sterilization. None of that, that is not what this community is about. It is voluntary service provision for women and families who want it. But those studies have demonstrated in terms of increasing resilience and climate change impacts that if you invest in family planning, that it's cheaper and that you get a quicker return on that dollar and that you're able to have better impacts on CO2 emissions, for example, than nuclear or other typical interventions that we might think of in a climate change space. So there are a number of studies that have looked at that and examined that question. The other part of it is when I go to communities on the ground, they say to me, this makes sense. Number one, it makes sense. It resonates well with our lives and what we want. It makes sense, CENTS. It's not very expensive. It's cost effective. And it makes sense. It sounds good. It smells good. This should resonate with people. So there's an opportunity to think about the return on investment, the impact that it can have in a short period of time. Some of the longer climate change interventions will take a longer time to deliver results, and it's what the communities want. So there's actually quite a number of studies that have been done by USAID and others that have shown that an investment, a dollar of investment in family planning interventions is the equivalent of $4 of investment in overall development spending that's typically done.
Hi, thank you. This has been great. I'm Meredith Maynard from Relief International, and I'm wondering, my question is, when do we think the discourse among donors or policymakers will move from mitigation to adaptation? We see mitigation efforts are invaluable and necessary, but, you know, climate change is happening already, and do you know of increases in adaptation measures or initiatives that are taking place?
So, you know, it's a question we've been asking for a little while now, I think, in our community. And, you know, once again, I was surprised that at times I still have to make this case. 3 conversations between today and yesterday, I had folks who I think are well positioned saying to me, oh, adaptation, it means we failed. And I was like, oh, you're still saying that now? So, but I think we have turned a corner. When you look, I work closely with a partner in Bangladesh who is the senior advisor to for the climate change negotiations for the group of poorest countries, right? And when they're looking at the financing mechanisms for adaptation, they're saying that at least half of that money should be, financing mechanisms for climate, at least half of that money should be going for adaptation, and a certain percentage of that should be targeted to those who are most vulnerable. I think that is getting receptivity at the local levels with national governments. But I just met with Germany's former Minister of the Environment, and I was telling him about our work in Jamaica. And I was saying, well, you know, I was working with these climate change focal points in Jamaica. They're developing Jamaica's national adaptation strategy. We're looking at their bargaining position, their negotiation position with the other developing countries going into Paris. What's your take on that block going into Paris? And he immediately dismissed it. He was like, oh, they don't matter. Like, I'm from that part of the world. Hold on, let's talk about this. But it's interesting. You go into the G7 and you have those discussions or those circles. I do think some of that still lingers. I do feel there is more receptivity with others do. It's coming up more and more. And I think we're making some progress, but there's still a lot of work to go. But it's happening a little bit more at the national level, I think.
I haven't heard a comment like adaptation is a surrender in a long time. Most of the donors that I'm with USAID, AIDS program took off in 2008, 2009. I think we have more on adaptation than on RED and clean energy, not combined, but individually. And the NAP, the National Adaptation Planning work at the negotiations has got quite a lot of attention and quite a lot of focus. Other donors that I work with have big adaptation programs. It's partly the world that I sit in because I'm on the adaptation side. I thought you were going to say, when are we going to break down this Berlin Wall between adaptation and mitigation, start treating them as a back and forth as a systemic problem. Let's say thank you to Roger-Mark. That was great.